Over the past 10 years, I've taught and trained a variety of students and professionals in different disciplines. And over that time period, I've noticed 3 key habits all of the top performers practice and possess. Habits that in many ways are the exact opposite of what you'd expect, but which result in the highest levels of learning and achievement. In this video, I'll lay out what these 3 habits are, the actual science behind them, and how you can start implementing them to get the same results. Starting with the first habit: interrupting negative feedback loops. In the early 1900s, the French psychologist Alfred Binet developed what would eventually become the first IQ test. However, he explicitly specified that this test was to be used to determine which students needed extra help and not as some sort of fixed label to identify someone's intelligence level. As Binet stated in his writing on IQ, our purpose is to be able to measure the intellectual capacity of a child. We should therefore study his condition at the time, and that only. We have nothing to do either with his past history or his future. Ignoring the limitations of this IQ measure and instead using it as a label for innate intelligence, he explained, could lead to a vicious cycle. As he elaborates, in a class where we find the best, we must also find the worst. And with this, a teacher must not be preoccupied. In other words, he explains, labeling a student as more or less intelligent might cause the teacher to change how they treat that student in the classroom, even unconsciously, leading to worse outcomes for the student and further reinforcing the label. The more the label is reinforced, the more the student treats the student according to the label, further reinforcing that label, and so on. And this effect, confirmed through subsequent research over decades, has come to be known as the Pygmalion effect. This phenomenon, generally speaking, is what is called a negative feedback loop. And as an educator who has taught all types of students with all types of abilities, from grade school to the university level, I've observed this negative feedback loop again and again. However, even though I do my best not to label students, some of the worst sort of labeling is students' own self-labeling. And so the biggest difference I've seen between high performers and low performers isn't some fixed innate ability. Instead, it's a student's ability to mentally interrupt that toxic self-labeling feedback loop. For instance, pretty much every time I've taught a class or even any topic one-on-one, there are naturally some students who pick up on the material right away and find it easy. As a result, the feedback loop they develop is a positive one. Internally, they're thinking, I'm pretty good at this. I must be pretty smart. They've now labeled themselves as smart, which in addition to how the teacher might treat them, causes them to treat themselves differently. In fact, this label becomes so powerful for them that when they do encounter something that is harder for them, they naturally interpret it according to the paradigm that the label has created for them. For instance, they might think something like, this problem is pretty difficult, but I'm smart, so it must simply be hard because I haven't practiced this enough. Or they might even go so far as to conclude, this must be the kind of question designed for smart people. It's pretty incredible how the stories we tell ourselves shape our behavior, isn't it? Well, interestingly enough, these are not the top performers I'm referring to. Instead, I'm referring to those who experience the opposite effect, yet overcome it. You see, there's another group of students who self-label in the same way the students who find the material easy do, except they make the exact opposite conclusions. I'm pretty bad at this. I must be stupid. And this question is hard because I'm stupid. There are many students who operate with this way of thinking, and it's one of the top reasons people fail to progress with their learning, including maybe even you. And this is scientifically pretty well established. Research has shown that when various factors such as socioeconomic status are controlled for, students who have a high belief in their ability, sometimes referred to as self-efficacy, tend to have better academic outcomes than those who have low belief in their ability, and importantly, the effects of this relationship do seem to be causal rather than simply correlational. And this is consistent with my own experience of teaching. Students who struggle at first but maintain that ability to interrupt that negative cycle of self-talk and self-labeling, they are the ones who often outperform the other students who naturally find the material easy. And why? Well, that leads to our next habit: translation into your learning language. The reality that I found about how people overcome that toxic process to create a positive feedback loop is truly profound. And most people who consider themselves avid self-learners almost never come to realize this. And this profound truth is that they overcome this negative feedback loop by identifying what I call their learning language. Now, to understand this concept of a learning language, let's take another look at the types of students we've been discussing. On one hand, we have those types of students who hear me explain a concept in class or in a one-on-one session and immediately grasp it. In other words, in the standard textbook way I've described it, they've immediately understood it. Essentially, my understanding of the language on this topic and their understanding of the language on this topic match. We're speaking the same language. But those students who struggle, well, they simply don't understand the language I'm speaking. I mean, yes, we are both speaking English, but there's a deeper technical language that they don't understand. Although this happens in both literary subjects and math-based subjects, the most obvious way to understand this is by taking a look at math. So take a look at this problem. If you can figure this out pretty fast, good for you. If you can't, and if you were my student, the first thing I would examine is your linguistic understanding of the terms. For instance, if you don't understand that the word of translates to multiply, or that the word is translates to equals, then of course you're gonna struggle. Alternatively, you might already understand this, but even in this case, your issue is probably still a linguistic one. For instance, you might better understand a problem like this with metaphors or with concrete visual examples. For instance, I distinctly remember struggling to teach a student about the function x squared and how we can change this function to shift it to different areas on the graph, and I was getting pretty frustrated. But then I found his language. X squared at 0.00, I told him, is like an ice cream sundae sitting on a table, face up. When we add numbers to this function in certain ways, it tells us where to move the ice cream sundae on this table. And then he immediately understood. And so how do you truly break that negative feedback loop? It's by realizing that if you don't understand something, it's not because you're stupid. Instead, it's most likely because, in a very real sense, the concept hasn't been communicated to you in a language you understand. And we all have different languages, so to speak, based on our prior experiences throughout our lives, and therefore use terms and vocabulary in slightly different ways that are subjective to various interpretations. But that says nothing about your innate intelligence. So what's your learning language, and how do you need to adapt what and how you're learning in order to start understanding in the most optimal way? Well, once you figure this out, you can then truly outperform the majority of people by engaging in our third habit, learning for transferability. It might be an unpopular opinion, but I believe we are unduly mislabeling a lot of students as top performing who might not actually be. Allow me to explain. In the US, standardized tests such as the SAT and ACT, which I've taught extensively, as well as the extremely difficult Gaokao exams in China, train students how to do what I call cram and dump. On the SAT, for instance, students do repeated drills and practice tests to get familiar enough with the test material such that when they see certain keywords, phrases, or structures within a question, it immediately cues them to use such and such a strategy to solve the problem. And it's formulaic. If you drill yourself enough at a massive volume, eventually you'll start recognizing these patterns well enough that you can perform well on a test like this, almost without really thinking. And again, I should know because I've at this point helped countless students get significant increases on their test scores for this exam. Now, for all their flaws, I do think there are merits to multiple choice tests like this. For instance, if you perform well on this test, you have indeed developed some level of critical thinking skills and some level of strategy and pattern recognition ability when it comes to mathematical computation. And don't get me wrong, these are important skills that most people lack. But let's explore the limitations of labeling someone as intelligent or high performing if they do well on this test. Let's take a look at this SAT reading question, for example. Now, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it off the bat. I mean, if someone can get this question right, surely they're a great thinker, right? Well, let's take a step back and consider two problems with this claim. The first problem is that this test, like all multiple choice tests, must have only one right answer per question, which means the test makers must leave specific clues and structures in each question which make it so that the text cannot in any way be left up to interpretation. And so in the first place, these types of tests are very much unlike real life, in which there are multiple potential right answers, and we need to use divergent thinking to come up with creative solutions. This type of skill, which is extremely important, is not tested. But that's not even the biggest issue. The second issue is this. Recall how I stated that the test makers need to form these questions in a certain structure in order to ensure that there is one and only one right answer that is not open to interpretation? Well, that structure can be hacked. As you can imagine, educators such as I have figured out this structure, and what we do is simply design strategies that help students exploit this structure. For instance, let's go back to our reading question, and in this question we can see that there are many repeated themes. These serve as clues to the test taker, clues that the test maker once again must include in order to make the test objective, with only one right answer. And as I've often taught students, one of the main ways to solve a question like this is to simply glaze over most of the details of the text, identify the keywords in the question, note the repeated words, phrases, or themes in the text, and then match the answer to those themes. Is this, in some sense, teaching you how to identify and collect evidence? Yes, it is, but it's also not really how you would collect evidence in the real world. And so if you can collect evidence and make correct conclusions on this test, is it really a measure of how well you can do the same thing in the real world? I highly doubt that, and the available research on this seems to agree with me. And so what's the point I'm trying to make here about transferability? And what exactly is it in the first place? Well, you can think of transferability as the exact opposite of the cram and dump approach I just described, in which you can cram really hard for a short period of time, take a test, and then forget everything afterward. Research has shown that high performance on tests such as the SAT and ACT do not result in what is called far transfer, in which the skills learned in one context translate into other contexts. And so what you want to do is always make sure you're interleaving topics, learning multiple skills at once, and finding ways to connect those skills to each other in order to increase your retention and application of those skills. Fortunately, I have an entire video on how you can do this, and so if you want to master this habit, then be sure to watch this next.